Once you go screaming over the edge, it's all over. Ain't no fucking coming back from that.
Want this? Fused here. High time I crumb the fuck up.
Looky here, boy, you are in trouble.
Show 'em you got this. It's time to cut loose, no holding back.
So when you tell me I'm the reason, I just can't believe the love. I so wanna call you. So what do you wanna do with your point of view?
Hey everybody, this is Isaiah and welcome back to Magic System Monday. Today I would like to talk about Cyberpunk Edgerunners. Now hold on, wait a minute. Edgerunners? You know, like where they use technology? That's not magic. Surely that doesn't count. People use the opposite version of that argument when it comes to Full Metal Alchemist. They often say, why do you keep calling this a magic system? You know, alchemy's not a magic, it's science. It's like, and you can almost hear the snark in people's voices when they say this, as they push up their glasses and dust off their hands, to remove the Cheeto dust on their shirt. Having said that though, it does count, and it allows people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do in the real world, so it counts. But it's not exactly the technology and stuff that I want to talk about in Edgerunners today. It is a phenomena that often exists in a lot of stories with magic systems and different power systems that can be used either very, very well or very poorly. In Edgerunner's case, the main characters kind of descend into madness and how it's done relatively poorly compared to some other works of fiction and how it could have been better. Now, to be clear, the type of descent into madness that this main character is facing is one that in his world is called cyberpsychosis. While Edgerunner's version of it is kind of unique, there are a lot of power systems or stories that involve a main character or other characters going crazy or going mad off of using their powers. In Edgerunners, which is built in the same universe as Cyberpunk 2077, pretty much every human to some degree or another is mechanically augmented. They swap out portions of their body, they make upgrades to their body, they put computer chips in their neck and their brains and their heads, make better eyes, all of these things that they surgically implant into themselves and replace normal body parts with to make themselves better off. In extreme cases, making most of their body mechanical, and this is called chroming out. The issue is that any degree of replacing your body parts with the machines in this world seems to have some kind of effect on the mind and the body. There's a strain there. If you go overboard, typically the higher grade machinery we work with, the more this psychosis seems to take place, people start to kind of mentally unravel. And if I'm not mistaken, there's sort of a medication that they can use to kind of mitigate this fact. So it prevents their body from having adverse side effects from these machines being implanted into it. But for those characters who chrome out too much or kind of go off the deep end with how many upgrades they get onto their body, it's usually not enough to stop them from going crazy. And this is eventually kind of what we see with the main character. As the story starts, it pretty much foreshadows the fact that he is going to chrome out, go off the deep end, and get cyberpsychosis, which will lead to or have a part to play in his death. In the final couple fights of the story, where he chromed up and donned this huge, massive anti-gravity mech, that was entirely necessary for the plot. So I'm not going to try to rag on the fact that that happened. In the situation he was in, it was pretty much the only real way out that he knew of. I can't hold that against him. But for everything up to that point, because he was already going cyber-psycho up to that point, with the exception of the first couple of pieces of equipment that he got at the beginning of the story, his chroming up to the extent that he did was actually entirely unnecessary. So the first piece of equipment that he gets is what's called the sandevistan. It is this machine that almost seems to kind of replace his spinal cord, and it gives him, whenever he activates it, super speed. Now, obviously, there is some risk to using it. It puts a strain on his body. That kind of bleeds into the whole cyberpsychosis effect. But before even realizing that immunoblockers are a thing and that people should take them, he activated the sandevistan a whopping 8 times in one day, without having any major side effects. Now, when he operates this thing, literally anybody without a sandevistan is entirely incapable of reacting to anything he does. He's basically the Flash. He can go as fast as he wants and no one can touch him. Only 2 people were ever capable of responding to him with this type of speed. Both of them had a sandevistan as well, and only one of them was able to outspeed him. And the one who did that was the strongest mercenary in the entire world, whose affinity for cyberware is so extreme that he became an entire robot. Now some might say that Isaiah, that comes at a cost, right? Because the strain on his body from the sandevistan is so intense. Because he experiences some strange side effects very, very early on and throughout the entire story just from using that alone. To that, I disagree. I agree in technicality and disagree in functionality. He experiences what I like to call a threat cost. Now, a lot of times in magic systems where you get some kind of backlash from using certain powers or spells, where a person doesn't die immediately, writers are responsible for proving that there is some consequence for using that power. 9 times out of 10, there isn't any really. But they pretend that there is. And they give you things like a character getting a nosebleed or passing out conveniently after the fight is over, and never when there's any real danger going on. It's things like that, where they assure you that there is some genuine threat to using this power, but it never gets actually fulfilled upon or proven until the writer wants that character to die. So when it comes to things like that, those small things, like I said, like nosebleeds or conveniently passing out when there's zero threat around, always when there's zero threat around, they never do it in front of an enemy, or at least almost never. Another example of this would be like Itachi, where Itachi in Naruto Shippuden was actually sick and he was basically on his deathbed, and he was basically going blind at the time too. But despite bleeding out of his mouth and his nose and literally being about to keel over and die, he's capable of having these massive epic battles and using these overpowered abilities that push him to his breaking point without actually experiencing any real side effects until he finally keeled over. Need I remind you that Itachi was basically blind at that point, and yet he suffered no drawbacks that affected him in combat at all. His accuracy took no losses. In the moments where it actually mattered, these characters often don't even face an actual drop in combat capability, despite the fact that their body and mind is so heavily wounded. And we see this with David as well for the most part. He only experiences these drawbacks in between moments of fighting, which ultimately makes these drawbacks irrelevant. All these are the writers trying their best to assure us that there is some threat or consequence looming over them. But in reality, there isn't until they have their final big moment. So in reality, there aren't any side effects until that moment where until the moment the writer decides that their plot armor is gone. Which, by the way, is almost always entirely predictable. So for those of you who believe that the shaking of hands that he got and his nosebleeds and his heavy breathing were actual genuine costs, unfortunately I simply disagree. Despite the strain he had with just the sandevistan alone, he goes on to chrome out his entire body, and still doesn't experience anything too major until the very end of the story. Actually, no, to be fair, I think there was this one moment in, I think, episode 7 or 8 where he accidentally killed an innocent person, but even then, he wasn't in danger at the time. The person literally could not hurt him, and he had already killed his target. So the thing I said earlier about this only happening when they're safe and when they're out of combat still applies, even though him freaking out and killing that lady totally counts as a drawback. So those minor things are simply kind of irrelevant. So the cost he experiences through his sandevistan mostly only serve to slow him down just a little bit, and justify why he's not using it 24/7, even though he kind of is. All the while, his speed goes unmatched. After he got his sandevistan, there was barely any real reason to chrome out much more than that. To be fair, he is a brawler type because his bullets don't speed up with him, so it makes sense that he wanted to get some arm and leg enhancements to increase his combat functionality, and this ended up being kind of how he beat that one of the characters who also had a sandevistan. He enhanced his feet to boost his speed, as well as his lungs to increase his endurance. So it was things like that that gave him an edge in that fight and allowed him to make the most of his sandevistan. However, chroming out the rest of his body was not necessary. We've also seen throughout the story that for normal-sized characters, their ability to enhance their strength only really gives them very limited gains. There are not a lot of situations where they absolutely need to have that much firepower aside from their guns and firearms. But what about endurance? Well, it stands to reason that a person who is chromed out with their entire body made of machinery would probably be a lot more durable than a normal human being, right? There's another thing that Edgerunners does that a lot of works of fiction do that I'm not attempting to rag on, I'm just observing it. And this has some effects that kind of affect how David's cyberpsychosis doesn't make any sense. See, in real life, human beings, even the strong ones, are relatively squishy, all things considered. Very easy to kill and not very durable. Even the biggest of us can go down to things like gunfire or an axe and things like that, and even an RPG. Now, there are different degrees of defensive power that these characters have. Like, some of them are built better than others because of their machinery. We also see the same thing with firearms, with people's firepower, their explosives, etc., etc. And generally speaking, with a lot of works of fiction and in the real world, like I said, firepower often scales higher than defensive power. So even people who are very defensively inclined simply don't stand a chance against a lot of this heavy attacks. And that shows in the series too. Well, there's a couple of occasions where characters claim that certain types of firepower are not strong enough to scratch certain pieces of equipment and machinery. We never really get major proof of this. I think there are a couple of occasions where we see like minor firearms not being able to destroy like extremely high-end stuff, but with the exception of stuff like that, pretty much every major character or enemy who attacks with something and hits someone, they do actual damage 95% of the time. Even Barrett, even Maine, the guy who looks like Barrett, like I mentioned earlier, he's built the biggest and the sturdiest out of his entire team. And when he got attacked by a special forces unit, he got ripped apart immediately. This is the same with basically every other cyber psycho we see in the series. Once people actually start shooting at them and hitting, they get torn apart pretty quickly. Unfortunately, there's just no proof in this work of fiction that it matters 99% of the time. So his defensive power was never helping him while chroming out. And his sandevistan and the things he built around that were pretty much all he needed to remain efficient in combat. Despite this, the story has us attempts to have us believe that this chroming out is something that he believes to be absolutely necessary to attain his dreams, when in reality, just to make him look big and mechanical, because that's kind of the flavor of the world. So aside from the things I've already mentioned, every other augmentation he has is kind of pointless. So when he finally goes cyber psycho and goes crazy and, he dies and everything, I don't really feel all that strongly about it. I don't really feel like, oh, it was tragic, but it had to happen this way. Because aside from that last mech he put on, which was entirely necessary, everything else simply wasn't. Well guys, I realized the video was getting kind of long at this point, and I didn't want to drag it out too much further, even though I had a couple more things to say. I was going to do an extended cut, but I have decided that I'm just going to make a second really short video to just round out the information in this one, regarding how we can use these ideas that Cyberpunk seems to have about cost and insanity and use them in an effective way. And I'm going to contrast that with a couple of other series, one being an anime and one being another work of fiction. That's a book. So until then, this is Isaiah from Magic System Monday, and you haven't seen the last of me.
Still watching you.